G'day, Michael from ironbarkgamesstudio, and welcome to the 7th part of this series, which is going to be the bridge between our modeling software Blender and our texturing software Substance Painter. Three things we're going to do in this tutorial today. First is we're going to check the face orientation of our model, making sure that all of our faces are pointing in the correct direction. The second thing we're going to do is apply materials to both the low and high poly meshes. And then the third thing we're going to do is jump into Substance Painter and we're going to bake our high poly details onto the low poly mesh. So jumping into Blender, from the previous video we have UV unwrapped all of our low poly meshes, so all of these meshes in here have been UV mapped. Remembering that we don't have to UV unwrap the high poly meshes, it doesn't matter what their mapping is like at all. The first thing we're going to check is the orientation of all of our meshes. Two ways we can do this. First, if we click on this drop down up here in the shading, we can turn on backface culling. And backface culling is going to represent what our mesh is going to look like in a game engine. So a game engine only renders one side of a face, and we can see here that the outside cloth, that's not being rendered from this direction, but it's being rendered from inside. So we're going to want to have to flip that out the other way around. The other way to check this is if I turn off backface culling, and then I just drop down this one here, the overlays, and I turn on geometry face orientation, and that is going to give it a very explicit view of what is pointing in what direction. So the blue is facing outwards, so that's pointing in the correct direction, whereas the red is the back faces, and we can see on the inside that the blue is facing inwards. Very easy fix to this. I'm going to select the outer coat here, I'm going to go into edit mode, I'm going to select all of the faces which are pointing in the wrong direction. In this case it is all of them, but if I had particular faces I just select those. I can then press Alt N to bring up the normals menu, and then I'm just going to click on flip. So I'm just going to make sure that blue is facing on the outside. All going well, the majority of the model should appear blue. It's just the cloth which was red, and that is mainly due to the cloth being a single-sided mesh and not having a thickness or interior to it. The options for single-sided meshes in a game engine could include a double-sided shader, or duplicating and flipping the mesh, but for now we're just going to flip the existing mesh so that the blue is facing outwards. We also need to flip the normals for any high poly meshes as well, as the normals need to be aligned in the same direction for both the low and high poly meshes. So let's get out of edit mode on that. I'm just going to hide the low poly meshes. I'm going to enable the high poly meshes, and we can see that it's flipped in the same direction just because it was a complete copy. So I'm going to select that, Tab, A, Alt N, and then flip. And let's just hide that high poly group and bring the low poly ones back. And when we're done, we can just come back up here and we can turn the face orientation off again. Okay, now we need to apply a material to our character. So the material is the thing that we're going to be texturing on inside of Substance Painter. Like I said in the last tutorial, you can have multiple materials for a character, but we just have one single UV grid and we're just going to have one single material. So I'm going to come to the material properties here. I'm going to select the body to start off with, and all of our low poly meshes are going to have our UV grid material in here. So I'm just going to click on the X to unlink it there. I'm going to click on New. I'm going to give this a name, something like MAT for material, underscore, and then I'm going to go my character's name, which is Fleur. And I'm going to apply this material to all of the different pieces. So selecting the helmet, and just drop down this here, Matt underscore Fleur. But instead of having to do this manually for every single piece, we can just select all of our pieces. So I'm just going to left click and drag, marquee select everything. And then I'm going to click on this little drop down here, and I'm going to go copy material to selected. So now all of our different pieces should have copied that same material that we applied to just the body, and the helmet in that case. Okay, that's all we have to do for the low poly mesh, so let's just hide that collection there, and we'll unhide the high poly one. We'll open that up. And this is where we can start assigning materials to the high poly mesh. Now these materials we're not going to be texturing onto, but we can use them as an ID map. So inside of Substance Painter, we can use specific colors to identify parts which we want to apply specific textures to. So say I grab the body here and then / to isolate it. And then I'm going to add a number of materials in here, which I'm going to use as ID map colors. So just click on the plus, click on new. And for each one of these, I'm going to go ID underscore and then name whatever that part of the character is. So in this case, we'll go body. We'll add another one for the skin. We'll add one for the armor. Well, we're going to add multiple ones for the armor. We're going to have different highlights and accent colors to it. Okay, and it's important that we give each one of these a unique color and then apply it to a specific area of the character. So in the case of the body, let's give it a green color. And we're not going to see it on the body for two reasons. First of all, it's not applied anywhere. Second of all, we need to change the shading type. So up here, we'll change the shading to viewport shading, material preview. Currently, all of our faces have the material, the default material assigned to it. So we'll go tab. So I'll just start selecting these. C is probably the easiest option. You can also hold down Alt and left click to select those loops. Might just go into X-ray and select that whole arm there, but we don't want fin in here because that's going to be the skin mesh. Okay, with all the body selected, I'm then going to select the ID underscore body material and then click sign. And that's just going to appear this ghastly green color, which is exactly what we want. So let's select areas of the skin now. And we'll select the skin ID, assign. We'll also need to assign a color to it. Let's go to a blue. It doesn't matter what color you add. The only thing that matters is that it's different from all of the other colors. So let's select this top extruded piece of armor now. And we'll assign this armor 1, and let's give it a color as well. This pink color, why not? So maybe also add it to this little bit in here, assign armor 1, and maybe that bit as well. Let's work our way down the boot. Okay, now let's select these next sort of layer of armor here. And let's assign armor 2 to this one, and again give it a color. Let's just keep working around the wheel. And we'll also add armor 2 down here. Add that as armor 3. Again, give it a color. Go a yellow. Awesome. So creating ID maps is not necessary when we get into Substance Painter, but it is going to help a lot, particularly for sculpted or high poly meshes. This just makes the selection process in Substance Painter way easier. I'm not going to worry about doing this for all of the other armor parts. If I did have intricate details or extrusions, then I would, but in this case, it's going to be fine just doing it for the body. Okay, now we're up to the point where we can export our meshes and get into Substance Painter. So I'm going to select all of my high poly meshes in here. And then I'm going to go to File, Export, and choose FBX. Find a location to save it. Make sure to tick on Selected Objects, so only the objects you have selected are going to be saved in this file. Everything else can be left as default. We'll come down here and we'll give it a name. So let's go hi.fbx, and then we'll just export that. Once that's done, we can hide our high poly meshes and bring up our low poly meshes. We can select all of these. And once again, go to File, Export, FBX. Make sure Selected Objects is ticked on. And we're going to call this one low.fbx and click on Export. Alrighty, let's switch over into Substance Painter. So with a fresh theme, I'm going to go to File and New. For the template, I'm just going to leave it as PBR, Metallic Roughness, Alpha Blend, Starter Assets. We can always change this later. And then for the file, I'm going to click on Select. And I'm going to choose my low FBX export. For the document resolution, I'm going to change this to 4K. This document resolution is actually non-destructive. So you can set this to a lower resolution if your computer isn't as powerful, and then when you're exporting, you can up the resolution. So I don't feel like you have to go for the maximum resolution, you can always change it later. Then we're going to go OK. So the model is going to appear here, but the first thing you should do is save your project. So when you create a new project, it doesn't automatically save it. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to go File and Save. And we're just going to save that as a .spp file, which is a Substance Painter project. Okay, so here's a quick breakdown on how to navigate the Substance Painter viewports. So if you hold down Alt and then hold down the left mouse button, that is going to orbit the view. Alt, left mouse button. If you hold down Alt, middle mouse button, that will pan the view. And then Alt, right mouse button, that is going to zoom in and out. Alternatively, you can use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out. Same thing for the 2D view on the right hand side, which is essentially our UV map. Alt, middle mouse to pan, Alt, right click to zoom, or mouse wheel to zoom. If you hold down Alt and left click to try to rotate, that is actually going to rotate the UV map here. If you don't want to do this, you can just hold down Shift and that'll just snap it back to that 90-degree angle. So now that the low poly mesh is in, we're going to have to bake a variety of what's called mesh maps. So I'm going to come across here to the texture set settings and then scroll down to where we can see the bake mesh maps. And we're going to bake quite a few of these. The normal map is the one that will be creating the high poly mesh on. And then the ID map is the one will be created from the colorful materials that we apply to the high poly mesh. The other maps, they're going to be generated based on the geometry of the low poly mesh. So let's click on Bake Mesh Maps. That's going to bring up this window here. First thing to do, I'm going to set the output size to 4K. I like to set this to what I intend to export my final textures as. So if I'm going to export them as 4K, I'll set this as 4K. Then down here, next to the high definition meshes, I'm going to click on this little folder icon here. And I'm going to select my high.fbx. Looking down here, the max frontal distance and the max rear distance, these will determine how far out or in the high poly detail is in comparison to the low poly mesh. We're going to leave them for now, but they may need further adjustment if the details are being cut off. Next, scrolling down, I'm going to turn the anti-aliasing on. So I'm going to set this to 8x8. You can set the anti-aliasing to any level to reduce the jaggedness in lines. The higher you put this though, the longer the bake will take. Set match from always to by mesh name, and notice that the low and high poly mesh suffix here and here is what we already have named our meshes in Blender. But if you name them something else in Blender, you can rename them here. This is going to bake the high poly detail based on the name of the mesh and nothing else around it. Do note that the meshes still need to be lined up in space. So don't move around the mesh locations in Blender before exporting. I'm going to go down to the Ambient Occlusion tab now, and I'm going to set the Self Occlusion from always to only say mesh name. Ambient Occlusion simulates light hitting the mesh and will add shadows to crevices or occluded areas. In this case, we only want meshes to affect their own ambient occlusion, otherwise a mesh such as the helmet would completely blanket the head in shadow. I'm now going to click on Bake Selected Textures. Awesome. And with that, we have baked our high poly detail onto our low poly mesh, along with a few other handy maps which we'll be using later in texturing. Now there are two mesh maps that are likely going to need some amount of cleanup, the normal and ambient occlusion maps. For example, if we take a look around the fingers, there's likely going to be some mess here because the geometry is quite close together and it can bleed across during the bake. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to unlink the normal and ambient occlusion maps from the mesh. So we can't edit them in here, so I'm going to click on the X there, and I'm going to click on the X there. And all of a sudden we've lost all of our beautiful baked details, but we're going to bring them back. So coming across back to the layers tab here, this is a paint layer, we don't need one of these, so I'm going to delete it. And I'm going to add in a fill layer. I'm going to call this fill layer normal. Now under the material section, I only need the normal channel, so I'm going to hold down Alt, left click on normal to deselect everything else except normal. Then I'm going to click on the normal button, and I'm going to search for the bake that I just did. So it's going to be the name of my material, so it's going to be map_fleur. That one there. So I'm just going to select that, and we can see we get our normal details back in. So the creases in the clothing there, also the details around the ankle, foot there. We're going to do the same for the ambient occlusion. So let's add another fill layer. Let's call this AO. And we don't have an AO channel in the material section just yet. So let's head across to the texture set settings. Just going to scroll up a little bit. And under the channels, I'm going to click the plus and add an ambient occlusion channel. Now if we head back to layers, we can see we have the AO there. So again, I'm going to hold down Alt, left click on AO to deselect everything except the ambient occlusion. Click on the ambient occlusion button, and then select the ambient occlusion that we just baked. So now we get those nice shadows back. So to do the cleaning, I'm going to tackle one at a time. So I'm going to hide the AO layer first and just work on the normal. So let's tackle the hands first. They're the most egregious examples of the bake bleeding over. Let's right click on the normal fill layer and add a white mask. So a white mask will keep all of the fill layer visible and then allow us to paint out details. So it's going to be easier to paint out detail as opposed to painting in the detail. A quick breakdown on how to use the paint tool in Substance Painter. So that's the tool up here, which is selected by default whenever you've got a paintable layer selected. If you hold down Control and then left mouse button and then move the mouse horizontally, that is going to change the flow. So the flow is up here. If you hold down Control, left click and move the mouse up and down, that is going to change the angle or the rotation of the brush. In this case it's a circle, so it's not really going to do anything, but we can see that down here in the angle settings of the paint properties. If you hold down Control, right mouse button and move the mouse left and right, that is going to adjust the scale, which is located up here. So Control, right click, left and right. And then holding down Control, right mouse button and moving the mouse up and down, that is going to adjust the hardness. So you can see that circle on the inside getting larger and smaller as the hardness increases or decreases. And that just determines the softness of the edges of the brush. Before starting, I'm going to turn on symmetry. So I'm going to click on the symmetry button up here. And I'm just going to make sure that line is right down the center of the object, which is good. If it's not, we can always make adjustments in here with the X offset. And I'm going to make sure I have a black brush selected to take away detail. We can scroll down here and we can see the grayscale setting is set to black. If we want to switch that to white, hit X on the keyboard. So X is the toggle between black and white. So black takes away, white adds. Let's decrease the brush size. Let's use something fairly soft. And maybe even decrease the flow a little bit as well. And I'm just going to left click and drag. And I'm going to paint out those nasty edges. And that should also do it to the other side of the hand because we've got our mirror symmetry turned on. And so now it's just a matter of going around the body and painting out any areas that you don't like. You could also do this for areas such as the cloth, which you don't like as well. So say you didn't like these wrinkles, you could always just left click and drag and smooth them out or just completely remove them. If we want to get to areas of the mesh which are hidden, we can click on this box here next to our layer, and we want to hide the helmet there. I'm going to reselect the mask, and then click on this button up the top, hide, ignore, excluded geometry, and now we can see our head beneath it, and we can make any adjustments. When we're done, just remember to click on this button again, and then unhide the helmet so that the normal is also applied to that piece. We're going to do the exact same process for the ambient occlusion. So let's just hide the normal for now, turn on the ambient occlusion. We're going to right click, add a white mask, and we're going to come into areas which don't look so good and then just paint them out. So again, between the fingers there's this sort of little bit of bleed over, so I'm just going to rub those areas out. Once again, using a nice soft brush. Once we're done, we can just turn the normal back on, and we can turn the symmetry off. And that is our final baked result. That'll be it for now in terms of the cleanup work in Substance. Next tutorial we will get into the texturing part, where we can make use of Substance Painter's powerful tools in conjunction with some of the other mesh maps we just baked, such as the curvature and position maps. Thanks for watching this video. Please like and subscribe if you found it useful. You can check out our Patreon link in the description with a variety of rewards such as starting files, tutorial notes, and early access to the rest of the series. And I'll see you in the next one.